Good evening, friends. God bless you. Let us continue our study on in understanding what it means when we read the story about Pharaoh and the deliverance of Israelites, where Scripture says number of places. If you read different versions, says that God hardened his heart, and we are trying to understand that if God has given a free will to everyone, and if God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, where is Pharaoh's free will? And for last few days, we are understanding now that the hardening the heart is basically God is when Pharaoh decided to harden his heart, God allowed him. God did not stop him. So if person wants to harden his heart, God can intervene and stop him. And in some cases, God does not intervene and stop people from hardening their heart. But the point is, it is not God who hardened the Pharaoh's heart, but it was the action initiated by Pharaoh himself. And we are continuing looking into the same stories in Exodus, but we are going to look in some different angle today. So hardening of Pharaoh is, there are 10 passages, not the plagues. The 10 scriptures indicates that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, the way it is translated. 10 passages, not the 10 plagues. 10 scriptures are written in such a way or translated in such a way from Hebrew that gives us the impression that God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. You can find in Exodus 4:21, Exodus 7:3, Exodus 9:12, Exodus 10:1, Exodus 10:20, Exodus 10:27, Exodus 11:10, Exodus 14:4, and Exodus 14:4, Exodus 14:8, and Exodus 14:17. However, there are also 10 different scriptures, not the plagues, 10 different scriptures that indicate that Pharaoh has hardened his own heart. The translation from Hebrew to English is done in such a way, it tells us these 10 next passages or scriptures where Pharaoh is clearly translated as is responsible for hardening his own heart. If you read Exodus 7:13, Exodus 7:14, Exodus 7:22, Exodus 8:15, Exodus 8:19, Exodus 8:32, Exodus 9:7, Exodus 9:34, Exodus 9:35, and Exodus 13:15. Those are the passages. So we have about 10 references in the scripture that points that or the 10 references where the translation is made in such a way that gives us impression that God has hardened the Pharaoh's heart. And there are 10 different passages we also can find. It suggests that, or translated in such a way, it gives us the impression that Pharaoh has hardened his own heart. Now, in terms of plagues, there are 10 plagues. But if you read those 10 plagues, there are 5 plagues clearly says that Pharaoh himself is responsible for hardening his heart. And the translation that is made, God hardened his heart, does not appear until the 6th plague is announced. So let us look at the Hebrew word that is used for hardening the heart. There are 2 different words. Specifically in all the scriptures I quoted, there are 2 specific Hebrew words has been used. And we are going to look into the very first Hebrew word, chazak. The chazak Hebrew word is translated into becoming hard. So Pharaoh's heart became chazak. That means Pharaoh's heart became hard. But if you understand the grammar of Hebrew language, the chazak is not a passive, nor does it indicate who is initiating the action. In grammatical terms, it is a stative verb. Stative verb means we don't know who initiated the action of hardening the heart. Kazakh means God. If you literally understand the grammatical way, then Kazakh means we don't know who started hardening the heart, God or Pharaoh. And when we look into New English Version NIV, it is ambiguous, particularly to this point. So Kazakh in NIV can be translated either way. You can translate whether God can harden the Pharaoh's heart or Pharaoh has hardened his own heart. However, some modern English translation has turned Kazakh word from static verb to a passive verb. And that's how the confusion starts. When you turn this static verb to passive verb, it points us to believe that God is the one who is hardening the heart. God is responsible for hardening the heart. But for last few days, we saw it from the scriptures that it is not God, the literature, the way the sentences are made. It is God is permitting Pharaoh to, when Pharaoh initiated that action of hardening his heart, God permitted him to, or allowed him to harden his heart. So if you look in, let's go back to the 10 plagues. The first plague is blood, that Pharaoh's heart became hard. So it was his own action, Exodus 7:22. Frogs, Pharaoh hardened his own heart, Exodus 8:15. Gnats, Pharaoh's heart was hard, Exodus 8:19. Flies, Pharaoh's hardened his own heart, Exodus 8:32. When livestock died, Pharaoh's heart was hard, Exodus 9:7. And now, sixth plague, the boils. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. That is the way it is translated. Exodus 9:12. Hail, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Exodus 9:34. Locusts, God announced that he has hardened Pharaoh's heart. Exodus 10:1, 10:20. And darkness, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Exodus 10:27. And death of the firstborn, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Exodus 11:10. But even in the translation, first 5 plagues clearly shows that Pharaoh hardened his heart. And for remaining 5 can be interpreted because that Kazakh word is a static verb. So you cannot definitely say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And the way it is written, we knew that now God is, when Pharaoh started hardening his heart, God did not stop him basically. God let him continue. So what we can come up with this conclusion, what conclusion we can draw? You can see that that there is a distinct change at the 6th plague. Pharaoh explicitly hardened his own heart, plague number 2 and 4, or the source of hardening was ambiguous, plague 1, 3, and 5. So there are 2 plagues. Plague number 2 and 4 clearly says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, even in the translation. And in the translation for plague number 1, 3, and 5, it is ambiguous. It can be translated both ways. Increasingly, in the 7th plague, Exodus 9:34, we clearly say that Pharaoh has hardened his heart. So the point is that why the author is using such a way that the translation, the expert who did the translation in various versions translated, and that is how we have got the confusion. The author uses this technique for a very specific reason. It is the brilliant diagnosis of the human condition. What that human mind, the human nature, or human heart is basically evil. And that is the writing clarifies the condition of the human heart. And if you look into that, God called Pharaoh for what? To humble himself and acknowledge that God, that he should acknowledge that Yahweh is the God. So God clearly gave Pharaoh two things. One, God told him to humble himself. And number two is God told him that he has to acknowledge God's authority. And third thing, God cannot be Pharaoh cannot redefine what is good and what is evil in Egyptian terms. It is God who can decide what is good and what is evil. But Pharaoh thinks that in those cultures, Pharaoh thinks that he is God. And he can define what is good and what is evil. So when God called Pharaoh, there are three specific reasons. God asked him to be humble himself. God asked him to acknowledge God's authority. And number three, God wanted him to understand that he cannot, Pharaoh is not God. He cannot redefine what is good and what is evil in Egyptian terms. So we see that it was not God who hardened his heart. It was Pharaoh who himself was hardening heart. And God was giving him opportunity that he would change his mind. Now, if Pharaoh would have changed his mind, he would have let Israelites go. Well, if God wanted to do something or explain himself to Israel, God would have used any other means. But God, when Pharaoh hardened his heart and when God allowed him to harden his heart, God took the actions or whatever the course God took, and that's how the Exodus story happened. We will continue our study understanding that another word is used for hardening the heart. But in all this study, we know the God's nature. We know the earth is full of, yesterday we talk about it, that God does not do any favoritism. God doesn't do favor to one person over another person. All is God's creation. The earth is full with God's glory and God's loving kindness. And God gives everyone the free will. And people will exercise the free will, and few people can harden their heart. And when people harden their heart, God may intervene and stop hardening their heart, or God may allow them continue to hardening that heart. And by doing that, God fulfills his purposes on earth. But it is not God. It is people, person, himself is responsible for hardening the heart. We'll continue our study tomorrow. May God bless you. Thank you.